Latter-day Contemplation is a podcast hosted by two Latter-day Saints who have found great value in experiencing God through walking a path of contemplation. The views expressed herein are our own.
Hello and welcome to Latter-day Contemplation. We're your hosts, Christopher Hurtado
And Riley Risto.
Latter-day Contemplation started as an exploration of contemplative practices from many traditions to enhance our discipleship of Jesus Christ. We're by no means experts in the topics we discuss, but what we have is an openness to questions, a hunger to discover truth wherever we can find it, and a desire to share in the transformative life of inner peace. We love that you've joined us, and we hope that you find value in this community.
Hello and welcome back to Latter-day Contemplation. I'm Riley Risto.
And I'm Christopher Hurtado.
Today it's our great pleasure to welcome LDS counselor and coach Dr. Finlayson Fife. Jennifer, we're so glad to have you on the program. Jennifer specializes in fostering couples in their intimate relationships. And as we've been talking about this, Chris, for a long time, about doing an episode on the divine feminine. But one thing always slowed us down. What is that?
We needed a feminine guest, a female guest. We don't have the authority to talk about this.
Right. So
it's just not how it works.
Just having the input and perspective of a female is really important for us. And we've talked a while about who that might be. And, you know, I've been a fan, Dr. Finlayson Fife, for a long time of your coaching online, and I'm on your Facebook page, and there's great input there, great stuff for relationships. And so I thought, what the heck, I'm going to reach out to you, and I'm so gratified that you would accept. So thanks and welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So today, as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about the divine feminine. Before I do, I want to mention too, just a quick plug for you. You are doing a podcast of your own, right?
Yeah, I've been on a lot of people's podcasts, so that's an archive that I have. But then I just started my own podcast several months ago called Room for Two, where I am doing couples coaching with couples around relationship and sexuality issues. So, of course, the couples are anonymous, but it allows people to listen in on the very common marital challenges that many of us face in our intimate relationships, and allows people to listen to my input on those struggles. And so it gives people a way to understand how they're participating in their challenges and what they can do to change them. So it's been very fun and well-received podcast.
And how would they find that? Just on all the big podcast providers?
Yes. Well, actually, because it's a subscription podcast, you can find it on my website. If you go to finlaysonfife.com, you'll see the podcast there, and there's more information about it. And, you know, so you can subscribe there, but then you can get it on all those podcast feeds.
And you're running a special on that right now.
Well, actually, the online courses are 20% off for Christmas. So I have courses for LDS couples on your relationship, your sexual relationship, and also courses on self and sexual development for men and women. So those are all 20% off. But probably about the time that this podcast releases, we are actually doing a promo on that Room for Two podcast. So it's $97 a year normally, and it will go down to $79 a year just for a week before Christmas.
Awesome. Look forward to that. Great. So we are talking about the divine feminine today. And, you know, this is a topic that is probably pretty popular lately, I would say. There's a lot of people talking about this. I'm not sure what spurred this groundswell of interest in the divine feminine. There's probably some overlap or carryover from those interested in this topic of Heavenly Mother, which is more heavily discussed in Latter-day Saint circles these days. But what, in your view, what are the dominant attributes of this idea of divine feminine?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, just to kind of give a little context here, I think that as human beings, well, first of all, in Taoism and other philosophies, there's been a recognition of a kind of fundamental tension or a fundamental differences in approach to life. And I think it has something to do with our biology, like the right and left brain, and different tendencies in how we process information, how we act and engage in the world. And so I think because women tend to be more towards the feminine intelligence, or what is in Taoism called yin, and men more towards the masculine, or what is called yang, there is the central tension. It's often a part of attraction. It's often a part of desire, that we're drawn to that opposite energy, or the energy where we're not as strong. So what divine yin is, or divine feminine, is more this sort of expressive, compassionate, collaborative, reflective, accepting tendency, the more receptive, intuitive. So it's more free-flowing. Just as a contrast, divine masculine is more about sort of structure, logic, action, firmness, loyalty. That's more the kind of the constant. And the divine feminine is more the expressive or the moving elements of our intelligence and of our humanity. And so that's kind of capturing some of the. And then one other thing I would say, and we can talk about any of this more, is that there's immature versions of feminine and mature versions of the feminine energy, just as the same with masculine. There's immature masculine and mature masculine. And so I think it's interesting that there is a renewed interest. I think in some ways that has a lot to do with, like, in the 1950s, for example, there was a lot of focus on what men are supposed to be, what women are supposed to be, very rigid ideas around masculine and feminine, very gender determined ideas that really limit men and women. They're immature. And then I think in the 70s with feminism and, just more anti-authoritarianism, which has been part of our culture in the last few decades, I think there's been much more, like, it's all open and fluid and so on. But I think that while there's strength in challenging that rigidity, I think that there's, to not acknowledge these differences, or to sort of pathologize those differences, I think we lose something that's also fundamental to who we are, and therefore undermines our strength. So I wonder if part of the renewed interest is that we're looking for something that we've overcorrected, that we've lost something that we need in order to be true to our individual strengths.
The pendulum has swung the other way.
Yes, exactly.
And you talk about the individual nature of these archetypal characteristics, where I think a lot of people get tripped up or hung up on is this idea that if I develop any of these characteristics as a man of the divine feminine, or vice versa as a woman of the divine masculine, that somehow I'm betraying myself, my nature.
Right. And I think that's not the right idea. In fact, I sometimes prefer to use yin and yang, because you don't get in this idea that as a woman I must embody only the feminine, or that somehow I'm being, like a man if I have masculine traits. I think that's not helpful. I think that if you think about Christ, he captures the divine masculine and the divine feminine. It is an ideal to develop the qualities, the strengths from both intelligences or proclivities, while I think we can still favor our natural preferred energy. And I think some research suggests that about 80% of women and 80% of men prefer that, or are stronger towards their natural, the feminine for a female, the masculine for a male. But as you develop, these are additive. This is not about, you can only have one set of characteristics. You want to be able, if you're a man, to be assertive and strong and determined, but you also are going to be lacking in your life if you don't develop those feminine qualities of being compassionate and receptive and thoughtful and reflective on your life. Just as with a woman, you want to also be capable of, fluidity and flexibility, but you want to also be able to be, able to be determined in your life or create a mission in your life. And so these are, as we develop, you often see as men and women get older that they start to develop more of the qualities on the other side. My dad became more compassionate, open-hearted, more emotional even as he got older. He was more thoughtful. He would cry more easily. My mother started her own business. She'd never done anything like that before, raised children, but then my dad was supporting her in what she was doing. And so they kind of took on opposite elements, and they were both stronger and better for having done that.
Do you think that there's any relation between the idea of incorporating both the masculine and feminine, or the yin and yang, and Christ in relation to his perfection? Is that what perfection means?
Yeah. So I have talked quite a bit about perfectionism in some of my teaching, and a lot of us have this limited idea that it means being flawless. And I think that comes from in Christ's time, perfection actually meant whole. And I think Christ and our theology, our LDS theology, is very much around growth into a developed being, becoming whole, developing our intelligence, becoming capable. After the Industrial Revolution, perfect started to take on the meaning of flawless, that it wasn't like an artisan who completes their art, but more that a machine has produced something and it's without flaw. And so that's kind of tapped into a lot of our kind of immature thinking that in order to be worthy or to have value, we must be without flaw, or imperfection, which I don't think we'll ever be. But to be whole is our goal, not to be, without vulnerability or limitation.
It's actually a teaching that's gaining some traction from the leadership of the church as well. I mean, someone in a recent general conference talked about the meaning of telos as complete rather than perfect, right? And so this idea it's gaining some traction, and it has a lot of validity. Now, you mentioned something that I love, is maybe replacing feminine and masculine, although we're going to continue to refer to them in this episode as divine feminine, with yin and yang. That really points to this idea that, these symbols that we've chosen, feminine and masculine, to represent these yin-yang energies, they're fairly arbitrary. They happen to correspond to something that we all experience because of the qualities that we are imbued with from each of those sides or archetypes, but they're sort of arbitrary. So by taking instead, I don't know what yin and yang mean literally. To me, they're Chinese words that have no meaning outside of just they symbolize something, right? And so that's almost better for me to have a meaningless word that just represents a set of attributes.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I just think because we have this, I shouldn't be masculine. That would make me, less of a woman or something. So it can make us resist those ideas, as opposed to, I want to be a developed person. I want to be capable of being assertive or analytical, because those are good human qualities. I want to develop those aspects of myself. But I also want to have these more yin qualities, because it makes life easier when you can pull from a range of attributes. One of the things I talk about a lot in my work is that we are beings in development. And when you're growing from immaturity into maturity, you develop into a solid and flexible self. So you become truer to who you are at the same time, and it seems paradoxical even, that you have more flexibility, you have more expansiveness in your ability to respond to things in life, because you've developed more capacity and skill. And I see this as, even in that Taoist symbol, the masculine and feminine, come together. I don't know if people can pull that image up in their mind, but within the yang, there is an element of yin, and within the yin, there's an element of yang. And so, I know in my husband, he has elements of yin that are so desirable to me, that I love, the compassion, the open-heartedness. There's masculine in me, or yang in me. In many ways, I'm more assertive than my husband is in different aspects. And so those are qualities that are kind of fundamental to wholeness and also to collaborative couplehood.
There's something you said that I really loved, that you said that these are human qualities. I'm reminded of Terence, who said, nothing human is alien to me. If you're human, then whether they're masculine or feminine or yin or yang qualities, they're human qualities. And you should incorporate all of them to be perfect, right? To be whole.
Yeah, and I do think there's a part of attraction where you're drawn to what you haven't yet developed. And that's good from just if you're going to parent, to have a range of capacities. But I think it's also about the elements of self that we want to develop, or we're trying to figure out. And so we're drawn to it. What a lot of us do is then go on to resent it and dislike it in our spouse, even though we found it attractive and compelling at first. But I think to better understand that as a what's the word, like a functional idea, to kind of reach for those capacities that are mysterious to us still, that are out of reach, but that compel us. and to embrace that tension that's a part of marriage or a part of ourselves in development, these aspects of self that we haven't yet mastered within ourselves.
Oh, I love that. It really points to sort of the immature versus mature approach to relationships. It seems like when young couples are initially attracted to each other, a lot of times the attraction is based on how it makes me feel. So I have like this selfishness almost where I'm with this person because they always tell me how pretty I look or how smart I am, and it makes me feel good. And so it's almost like a reflection of my own ego. But
Absolutely.
but at a certain point, to become a more mature player in this relationship, I have to not only be in it for how it makes me feel, but for what it offers me down the road. And that's drawing off the energy of the other person, because this opposites attract thing is real.
Yes. And to be in a relationship not out of an entitled position, I think just as you're saying, but more out of an embracing position. You're embracing the divine nature of this relationship because it drives your development. So you're in that fundamental tension that pressures your development into a more whole person. So when we're, just as you say, when we're immature, we're looking to find someone that will reinforce our sense of our desirability and of our legitimacy. And then we're hoping to lock that in, and then they have to love us because they promised God they would. Okay. So that's the immature version. And we can talk about it in terms of immature masculine and feminine in a minute, if that would be helpful, but it's need-based. It's like, I need you to legitimize me. And I want what's different than me to legitimize me. Rather than, and then what happens is that breeds resentment, because that won't legitimize you. And, when your partner does things differently than you and they don't legitimize or like the way that you're different than them, you can think something's wrong with the marriage, wrong with your spouse, wrong with you, and resent it, as opposed to, no, I locked in a system that will pressure my development to understand what I don't yet understand, to develop more flexibility, to develop more compassion, to develop more ability to hold my own in the best sense in a partnership, right? These are things that in order for that partnership to thrive, a kind of development must happen within the individual for the collective to thrive. And so if you can move into a position of embracing those differences and choosing and valuing that other person, even though they don't validate you, those are the couples that really come to understand a kind of freedom in marriage and in intimacy.
This is kind of a road I want to go down that I haven't planned on, but, when most of us enter into a relationship, we don't have any of this in mind. It's not like we're thinking, I'm really going to lock myself into a development track with a person who is going to challenge me at every level. No one thinks about that. I mean, if they do, they're like freaks, honestly, because it's got to be so rare. And so how do we go about, like, I've got a 21-year-old daughter who's unmarried and a son who's on a mission right now who's, in a relationship for the last couple of years with his girlfriend. And so for me, wanting to teach my daughter and son about how to approach on the front end a relationship that's going to be healthy for years to come, how would you go about that?
How would I say it? Well, I think one of the things I have said to my kids is that, the most important thing is to be capable within yourself of repentance. And what I mean is the ability to self-confront, to recognize your limitations and not make other people pay for your limitations or punish them for seeing them in you, and to allow that to develop yourself, to be in an honest relationship with who you are and who you are not yet, and to marry someone who can do the same. Because I think that's the single most important variable to growing into a real friendship. When you will not self-confront, won't look at yourself, demand that the other person feed you the picture of yourself that you want, or you're married to someone who won't do that, it really undermines the ability for that process to happen that a marriage can create in people. So I think I think that I, would talk to my daughter or son about the idea that this is a developmental process. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that in the beginning, it feels so good to be loved by them, to be desired by them, to feel chosen by them. Those are wonderful things. But when they start to break down, nothing is going wrong. That is, that it's starting to reveal some of the limitations that need to be revealed, and you can either resent that revelation or you can utilize it to keep growing in your capacity to love and be loved.
I feel like you're adding me, and I'm not comfortable with it right now. To use social media parlance, just at me next time. I recognized a few years back that usually when I get mad in my household, like I'm mad at my kids or I'm mad at my wife, it's coming from a place of that's my own limitation. Like I'm mad that I don't myself do that very well, and so I'm getting mad at someone else about the same thing. It's a weird dynamic.
They're pointing it out. They don't like it, and then it's like shoot the messenger. Get rid of the evidence. Yes, very tempting.
I've noticed the same thing.
Have you? Oh, I'm glad I'm not the only one. So are we fundamentally out of balance? Speaking like more meta now, back to culture and religion and whatnot, Christianity at large, or maybe within our own church. Are we fundamentally out of balance at this moment in one or the other set of attributes?
Probably. I mean, I have to say, I don't know, because I don't know if people were to do... So there's research that was done by Sandra Bem, for example, and there was a category of participants that would come up as androgynous. That is to say, she looked to see what culturally was defined as more masculine attributes, what was culturally defined as more feminine, and who scored high on both. And there is I can't remember, but it was 20% of her study tended to score as more androgynous. So some of that may be natural. There may be some people who naturally have some elements of both. Some are more strictly yin and some are more strictly yang. But I think that most people tend to favor an energy, and all of us have room for development. So that is to say, everybody, whatever you favor, has elements to become either more mature in your preferred energy and or to develop aspects of the other energy that you need for a life that's more balanced and flexible.
What does the energy look like when it's immature, Jennifer?
Yeah, it's more, so for example, immature, well, let me start with a kind of global idea. Immaturity is more dependency based. So some of our cultural ideas around what men should be, what women should be, are very dependent. That is to say, when the immature masculine needs to be needed, he needs to be seen as strong, even if he isn't. And so immature masculine wants to sort of dominate, own, act more intelligent than one is, more competent than one is. It's very, much like trying to demonstrate that you're on top, even if you are not. and it wants to control not just oneself, but others, to feel strong. Immature feminine is also dependent because that's more needy. So to need to be needed is a needy position. And being explicitly needy, of course, is a needy position. But it's more like, I want you to take care of me. I want you to give me a life. I want you to make me feel good about me because I'm insecure and uncertain. And if I can just slide underneath you, I'll make you feel like a man. And then you can make me feel like I'm a desirable woman. And that's inherently dependent. I don't know that there's another way to do it in the beginning because it's where we start. We're looking outside of ourselves to manage the question of who we are and whether or not we're sufficient. And a lot of us are taught to do them in these archetypal immature masculine and feminine ways. So many couples start out that way, and then they come to see me about the time that the resentment is just breaking the sense of friendship and partnership because the immature masculine doesn't feel reinforced, doesn't feel desired, admired, doesn't feel sufficient gratitude for all he provides. I'm just going to do it in the kind of stereotypical way. And the immature feminine is like, look, I don't feel good about myself. You don't make me feel desirable. You don't make me feel good about me. And what have you done for me lately? Kind of. And, that I've kind of capitulated to you and I don't feel good about me and it's your job. That's immature feminine. It's sort of hiding in that place of dependency. And so when people come to me, I'm helping them to start to see that dependent system, the immaturity and neediness in both positions, even though immature masculine is pseudo-strong. It looks to appear strong, but it isn't. It's highly dependent. It's highly rigid. It's highly terrified of being exposed for vulnerability. Sometimes immature feminine is afraid of her own strength and of her own autonomy and of her own ability to expose her own gifts and capacities. And so I'm working to help people see how they are creating the misery, they're co-creating the misery they're in, and how they're trying to utilize the other to manage a responsibility that resides within them to their own development and to their own strength, and to help them start to grow into stronger capacity within themselves in whatever variation that may mean for who they each individually are, right? So, yeah. And so that it's when you're more mature that you're able to really create partnership that's out of choice, not out of need, that's out of a desire for another person, not seeking reinforcement. So I talk about desire out of immaturity and desire out of maturity. Desire out of immaturity is I want you to reinforce me, make me feel good, make me feel desirable, reinforce my sense of self, versus desire out of maturity is I choose you. Even though you don't reinforce me oftentimes, that you're different than me, that I know who you are and I want you. I want to be close to you. I want you in my life. You are my friend, not because I need you to reinforce me, but because I want to bring my best to you and I want to share a life with you and share my sexuality with you. That's a desire that comes out of capacity to really embrace another person and the inherent tension that comes through doing that. But most people do that in the middle of a marriage, if they ever do it.
Something that you highlight that's really interesting to me, you can take any of these characteristics and by themselves, they're sort of neutral or androgynous, but it's the approach to that capacity or to that attribute that constitutes the masculine or feminine. So you highlighted, for instance, I've got X amount of capacity. On the masculine side, the immature masculine side, it's overestimating our capacity, believing we're more than we actually are at the moment. And on the feminine side, it's underestimating our capacity. And it's actually so to become more whole or complete is just to move to reality, to the reality of who we are.
Right. Absolutely.
That's why you call it repentance, right? It's about turning and seeing things the way they are in a new way, right? And which in this case is the way they are more realistically.
And that's like, if I have a kind of mantra that captures, the work I do with couples is the truth sets you free. The part that got edited out is the truth makes you miserable first, then it sets you free. So
Dang it.
You didn't want to lose readers.
And so it's like you have to wake up to who you are and who you are not. You have to wake up to reality. And that stretches us. And, a lot of times feminism has highlighted the abuses of immature masculine, right? Which is absolutely true and on point and something we need to see. But also, I think sometimes what it's underarticulated is the upside of immature feminine. I don't mean it's a true upside. It's like there's a reason why women have sometimes been collusive in that arrangement, because you don't have to grow into your strength. You don't have to be exposed. When Christ talks about the parable of the talents, it's like it's easier to kind of not develop, not grow, sometimes to hide that capacity, maybe as the immature feminine, because you've learned that you should be small to be desirable. I certainly remember that idea and that fear that if I really were to show my strength, maybe a man would not want me because I'd be a threat to his sense of capacity. And, and I had to kind of say that I would rather not be partnered if I have to be small to be in a partnership. I'd rather be who I am and be true to myself and find somebody who that is not threatening to. And I'm really glad I went that route because that's the only way you can have a marriage that's really happy, because the happiest people feel free to be themselves and to expand themselves in the context of marriage.
That sounds like a real testament to your husband, John, as well, who we just met pre-show.
Yeah. That
he is comfortable with your capacity being expressed.
Absolutely.
This is all really exciting.
Yeah. At our wedding dinner, this is before I really, I was still in my PhD program when John and I got married. And at our wedding dinner, he stood up and said, I know Jennifer has a real gift, and I want to support her in that gift because the world needs the gift she has. And it's like he could see it, and he already knew that and that was not threatening to him. and this was coming out of dating people where it did feel threatening, where, I had a guy I really liked who said, I just don't feel like a man when I'm with you. And I'm like, wow, what does that mean? Like, I'm that emasculating. I don't want to think of myself that way. But for John, that just wasn't the case. Like, it felt natural and comfortable and right for him to support that and it's, for me, that's a function of his strength, a function of his clarity of self, that he can support something for the greater good, even if it doesn't reinforce or make him look strong in some overt sense. And I respect that deeply.
It does speak to his development of more of the divine feminine side of things, which essentially is being willing to be submissive and take a supportive role.
Right, to support a larger mission. That's right. So I think I had a stronger sense of mission, even though to me it was unarticulated at that point. I didn't quite, I was thinking more about, being a mother and being home, which I did do for years. But I think that was in me. And I think John could feel that was in me. And it felt, that's right, that is a divine feminine quality, which is, it felt and has continued to feel comfortable to him to support that mission. And yeah, which has been such a gift for me, and I'm so grateful for it, and a gift to anybody that I've been able to help, because I do have this supportive, kind presence in my life that gives me that strength that I need.
That's beautiful.
So I wanted to, we've talked from almost like a secular standpoint here. Really, these concepts can apply to anybody, in or out of religion. But there's actually a pretty strong hint of this in our own tradition, if we'll follow it. And that is in the temple. There's a very gendered approach to the temple that, it may be somewhat a vestige of the tradition of separating the men and the women and having separate development tracks, but there also could be kind of a spiritual approach to this that really approximates a lot of what we're talking about here in the individual. And so if we see the temple as kind of that microcosm of the individual developing through the stages of becoming a complete person, then integrating the divine masculine and feminine within the individual, the temple really becomes a great symbol for that, doesn't it?
I've never thought about it, but yeah, maybe. That's interesting, that sense of, meaning when you look at developmental theory, and how boys and girls develop, like there is this period of separation that's really important for developing capacity to be a couple, to be able to be more integrated with a different self. And that's interesting. It's just an idea I haven't thought about before. So that this idea of developing wholeness, sometimes, the temple has evolved, and I've sometimes thought of it as immature earlier, where it was more about that dependency model of the feminine yields to the masculine. And that's been evolving and changing to be more symmetrical, which I think it must be. Because I think if you're going, the way I experienced it when I first went through was the feminine must yield to the masculine, which was disruptive for me. That felt wrong to me. And so I'm glad for the evolution and the changes, because for me, it always felt like, if the feminine only yields to the masculine, in as much as the masculine follows the divine, right? How does she know if the masculine's following the divine, except that she can also map what's divine? And so to me, it felt like a middleman and a vestige of an old model, not as that masculine and feminine must have equal authority ultimately if it's going to be collaborative. That is not that they both have the same strengths, but there is wisdom and divinity in both, and the ability to track what is divine and true in both, even if they have different roles or different qualities to offer to the body of Christ, to the divine entity. So I think if we do see that as this ability to develop those individual qualities, I think that's a wonderful idea.
We're going to keep going down this track a little bit, and we'll see if this opens up some avenues here. So I think what you felt in your first temple experience, and what a lot of women have felt, in past years before the liturgy has, as you say, kind of equalized, right, is that that women were submitting to men. And if we separate again the biological sex of the participants from the attributes of the divine masculine feminine, and we see the attributes as being part of the individual, is there something to be said for the natural divine feminine attribute of submissiveness, supporting, collaborating within the liturgy of submitting to the masculine? Not necessarily women to men, but feminine to masculine. Is there something to that? And then the other idea too is that, the masculine seeks you. It's almost like, I will impose upon you this commandment, this idea, this rule, this structure, this order, whatever. And conversely, the feminine is usually sought out. Like you have to really seek for that because it's underneath. So she's not putting herself at the forefront and telling you this is the way it's going to be, imposing. On the flip side, it's more persuading. It's like, you will come to me because you'll see the value in me. You'll seek me out. I don't know. Just that's an idea.
Right. Well, I think so. To your first question, I think there's first of all, there's a submission out of weakness, right? So there's immaturity in submission. Like, I don't know what I think, and I don't want to think about what I think, and I'll just do what you say, but I'll resent you if it doesn't go the right way. Okay. But then there's submission out of strength. That is to say that I will submit to this larger goal because my ego is not as important as my ability to support a larger reality. And so there's no question there is a very virtuous or submission from strength. And part of that divine feminine, there is this capacity to submit out of strength. And I think it's also part of what I teach women in my Art of Desire course is this ability to receive. There's a kind of receptivity that comes from strength of self. Like to be able to surrender to pleasure in sexuality is, for some that are more fearful, feel like that's to lose oneself, to kind of like surrender, and that's scary, right? But when you can actually know yourself, it develops your ability to surrender to pleasure or to surrender to a larger goal that's bigger than you, right? So there's no question this is a part of the archetypal divine feminine. It's a strength. It's something that society, community, relationships need in order to thrive. My critique of how we've tended to do this in the church is it's in the more immature form historically, and we are in evolution, in which I embrace and celebrate that we are in that evolution. But I think that because it was so gendered, and also these sort of layers of polygamy, and men have access to the divine and women do not. For me, it just felt painful and wrong.
Yeah, that's the context of our history, right? Because we suffer from literalizing everything instead of seeing below the surface at maybe what the symbols could be pointing to. And if you take that liturgy of the temple and follow it all the way up, the highest ordinance, the highest act in the temple is the sealing, is the communion of the divine masculine and the divine feminine together. And that, while that's a real thing between a couple as they're getting married for time and all eternity, it's also a symbol of what happens in the fully complete, developed, integrated human individual.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not right away in the ceremony, but eventually in the marriage, right? I understood Riley's question a little bit differently than you, Jennifer, and I may have just understood something that Riley wasn't even saying, but I was wondering, based on my understanding of Riley's question, if you would speak to this. What if in separating biological men from biological women in liturgy, what we're really doing is representing a separation of the divine masculine and feminine in each individual, regardless of gender, so that, again, as we've been saying, and as you've said, Jennifer, we can actually see what they are for, something. There's this and there's this, there's this and there's that, there's the yin and yang, and then we can actually bring them back together in this, what Jung called the mystery of conjunction, right? The mysterium conjunctionis. Well,
and one thing to add to that too is within that play, okay, that acting out of the liturgy, you have a witness couple that becomes the example of the two coming together frequently. It's like it's almost that dot that's in the yin and yang on each side that shows like, okay, you have a little bit of this in you. And so even though we've separated our attributes within the creation room, men over on the right, women on the left, we get to see the potential. Before we actually get to the sealing ordinance, we get to see the potential of what it could be as we bring Adam and Eve back together. And it says, you're to consider yourself as if you are respectively Adam and Eve. The old liturgy didn't have the word respectively in there. Interestingly enough, it was just you are to consider yourself as if you were Adam and Eve.
Oh.
Yeah, maybe you didn't know that part, huh?
That is. I like that.
So.
Yeah. Well, I think those are lovely ideas, actually. And I think one of our vulnerabilities is the prioritization of the masculine over the feminine. And I think this has happened in church culture, but it's happened in the larger culture. It's certainly there in Western culture. It's a danger, like in marriage, if there is a hierarchy of whose vote counts most, right? Because if we really put it as we are truly equal with difference, with different qualities, and there's a fundamental tension to that, that's where I see true goodness and development emerging. It's when you try to handle the anxiety of that fundamental tension by creating hierarchy within the couple that you really damn the progress of that couple. You really interfere with that marriage thriving.
There's damnation.
Or a community thriving.
There's damnation as we usually talk about it, Riley.
Absolutely.
As this actual epistemological concept, something that's happening to you that isn't this metaphysical or ontological thing that comes from God, but something that you're actually experiencing.
Creating.
Yes, creating for yourself, exactly.
Christopher, in kind of preparing for this show, we reached out to several of our followers on our Facebook page with Latter-day Peace Studies. We reached out to friends and neighbors because we felt like, Dr. Fife, this was an opportunity for us to, really stretch the boundaries and open our minds about this with you. And we got some interesting feedback. And I don't know if this is a great time to do it, but Christopher, what do you think about introducing what your sister shared with you?
So when I asked my sisters if they might have any questions for you, Jennifer, one of them said, I love how that sounds, the divine feminine, but I don't know anything about it. Maybe a question would be why? Why don't I know anything about that? It seems, being a woman, that I probably should.
Yes. We need more of that divine feminine. I think it's a way that we are damning ourselves, to use that idea, as a group by not making those qualities more explicit and more elevated within our communal thinking of the divine. Of course, it's in our theology, right? The mother, God, mother and father in heaven, that we have these parents, that they are an intimate couple, for lack of a better way of saying it. And yet mother is background and silenced, and, we don't know enough about this divine feminine. And I think this is very hard on the souls and psyches of many women that I work with, because they're looking for themselves, to go back to the temple. I think many women are looking for themselves in the ritual and see so much masculine, don't see enough of the feminine, the archetypal feminine, don't see enough of the feminine even in as God is represented, right? So I think that this is a way that our theology can evolve, and in my view, needs to evolve, because we do embrace the divine feminine. We have room to develop this more explicitly. And I think, I talked about this recently, but I was in a BYU class when I was a student, and the professor brought some hymns, and I can't remember the origin of these hymns. I can't remember if they were early LDS hymns but they were about Mother in Heaven, and they were written by women or a woman. I can't remember, but we just sang them in the class, and I started to cry. Like I didn't even know how much I needed that connection to my divine mother. And it's like my soul only knew it as I started to experience it and express it. And I think that we are looking for her. I think culturally, women are looking for her. We all need that understanding of what that strength is, because I think, I grew up hearing ideas that, obviously were not revealed ideas. These were cultural attempts to make sense of the silence around the divine feminine. But she's so sacred that Father in
Protecting her,
Heaven's
yeah.
got her locked in the back. Yeah, those kinds of ideas. And which suggests that the most high form of feminine is still weak or dependent or can't handle herself or can't be knowable. And I don't think those are very helpful ideas when you're, as a female, trying to figure out what do you identify with as a version of strength.
This reminds me of a poem that I shared with both my sisters and others whom I texted about these, this opportunity to ask questions. And it's from Carolyn Pearson. I'd like to read that. To our mother, remembering that Jesus named his father from the cross and said, Abba, Abba, why hast thou forsaken me? And remembering, too, that on the kibbutz I learned that even today children speaking Hebrew call their father Abba and their mother Ima, I'm amazed to find in my balancing hands 2 balancing words, and the first speaking of the new word is this, Ima, Ima, why have we forsaken thee? And so that leads me to this other question that is, and you spoke to this already a little bit, Jennifer, but if you could maybe answer this question for one of our listeners, from a friend who asks, is there a difference between the title God and the title Goddess? Will I as a woman ever be a god, or is it Goddess? Are the titles like man and woman, each having different biology and gifts? Having just read section 137, I wonder at the description from the prophet Joseph. I think this is a separate comment or with a question. He said he saw God on his throne and Christ next to him. Then he mentions male prophets, etc. Since I've read this book of poetry, she was referring to Carolyn Pearson's book, it was glaringly obvious that there was no mention of Heavenly Mother. Why is she absent from all of our recorded accounts of heavenly visions? I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah, well, these are questions I've certainly had for a long time and have cared very much about. And the hopeful part is that we are a faith of ongoing revelation and ongoing development. And we are also individually immature, but we are also institutionally immature, in my opinion. And as Joseph Smith talked about, and many church leaders have said, that we need to keep our hearts open to be able to receive greater wisdom. But I think we are often limited by the cultural immersion in which we exist, because we can't change what we can't see. And when we can't see it, because we're so accustomed to a way of thinking, that we limit what we can really understand about divinity. And so I wonder if part of our interest in the divine feminine is about our own evolution as people, that we know what questions to be asking. We're knowing where to seek. It's already in our theology. This is so much what the work I do is looking at our theology that provides for so much. And yet we often are interpreting it at an immature level. And yet there's so much there to provide for our ongoing spiritual, relational, and sexual development even. And so I think we have forsaken our mother. I think it's going to come from our ability to see. She's there, but can we see to bring her into our psyches and into our hearts? And so I think much of it is a lot of the work I do with women in the courses I teach and the workshops I do is helping women to embrace their strength unapologetically, embrace their capacity, embrace their wisdom, embrace their sensuality, embrace their sexuality. I mean, I've talked to women about being a female goddess, a sexual, sensual, emotive, earthy creature, which the divine feminine is, and to embrace the goodness that's in that. Because I think so often women have been taught to hide it, to press it down, to be afraid of it, to our shared weakness. When women are not able to embrace their own strength and their own capacity and their own wisdom, the marriage suffers. Men suffer for this also. Like sometimes we have the idea that patriarchy allows men to thrive and women not to. Well, everybody's suffering. I mean, really, because it's not whole. And so there's too much fear and pretense and not enough strength and wholeness in the couple. And we all need that.
Jennifer, what would you say to anyone, whether a man or a woman, who feels threatened by this image that you've given us of the divine feminine? It can be, I mean, I think of some of the things you said speak in terms of tropes that have been associated with witches, both in antiquity and modernity, because of the threat that they pose to sort of the established order, which has been patriarchal.
Well, what I would say is that that's pretty natural response. I think that it's also an immature response in the sense that, sometimes what I say is a strong man does not need a weak woman in order to be strong. So that is to say, strength begets strength, weakness begets weakness, and so it may feel threatening, but what we want is the capacity to be strong enough to handle that natural tension. If the feminine is about fluidity and expression and sensuality, there's often an inherent unease with it because it represents change, it represents uncertainty, it represents what we don't yet know, what we haven't yet mastered. And part of spiritual capacity is to tolerate better uncertainty. We don't really think of spiritual. We think of spiritual as having all the answers. We've got it all nailed down. We love that idea. I mean, who doesn't? Because that makes us feel less insecure. But really, I think it's more about the ability to tolerate what we don't yet know, what we can't control. Like as a parent, so much of loving is tolerating what you can't control, because that allows you to love and to care, even though it may put you up against disappointment or loss or, uncertainty. And so this ability to handle growth, I talk about discomfort for growth a lot. Faith is about reaching into the dark and tolerating what you don't yet know, what you haven't yet mastered. You have to handle that uncertainty to grow into deeper knowledge and wisdom. And the feminine often represents that uncertainty or change and shift. For us to be a robust faith community, we have to tolerate that inherent tension without trying to dominate it, snuff it out, push it away from us. It doesn't mean we just rush to every critique, of course, because there is a tension between the wisdom of conservatism and liberalism. There's wisdom in both, right? To be able to hold on to what we know. But as I listened to a podcast by Malcolm Gladwell several years ago called Generous Orthodoxy, and he talks about in a couple of different stories this fundamental tension between holding on to tradition but allowing it to evolve, and the flexibility that we need to stay relevant, to keep thriving. It's always uncomfortable. Growth periods are uncomfortable, but they give us the capacity we need to thrive in those periods of more stasis. And so it's learning to develop the capacity to embrace that tension and that uncertainty.
To back up to something else you said, Jennifer, you hinted at the idea that we have to seek Heavenly Mother to find her. And this is, we've forsaken her, as Carolyn Pearson Pearson has said. And so I know that we just finished a study of the Doctrine and Covenants as a church, and here at Latter-day Peace Studies, we podcasted all year on the Doctrine and Covenants. We have so many, all of these revelations that we have, they come from questions. We have so many examples of how the heavens are open to us when we ask questions. So keep asking those questions, guys.
Yeah, and one thing too you mentioned is, we're in this immature phase, and that's not necessarily a critique as much as it's just a chronological reality. Like, we've been around for 200 years. There are churches who have already worked through some of the bugs that we're kind of still working through. The beautiful thing about what we have is we've been bequeathed, so to speak, with this endowment of continuing revelation. I can't even imagine Joseph Smith, who was, famously railing against the creeds and the orthodoxy of his time, just going forth and instituting a new orthodoxy and saying, your orthodoxy is wrong. We're gonna institute this orthodoxy instead. That wasn't the model. That wasn't what he was trying to communicate. And in Doctrine and Covenants, Chris and I have talked about this extensively. It wasn't so much what came out of his exploration that was so revolutionary. It was the exploration itself. It's like teaching us that, we can do the same thing. We can ask, we can learn, we can explore and have new revelations just like he did. I mean, he's a person. We're persons. There's not much different there.
And our last episode was on perennialism. And so, considering that we are in this phase or this stage where others, among Christians have been through this phase or stage already and matured and, worked through it and passed it, we can actually turn to those other traditions and we can take the best because this is the fullness of times, right? We can take all of what has come down to us from God in all ages and incorporate it.
Well, and we have this tension of like, here are the rules, obedience has a virtue in it, has a value in it, but then personal revelation. So that is this intention between, here's the structure, but you must be a seeker. You must pursue what is true for you. You must take responsibility for your morality. And that's something I think we underemphasize to our detriment because we need that diversity. We need that wisdom that's coming from all of the different individuals in pursuit of truth for us to be strong. That will develop us. Whenever you have someone who starts subjugating their view out of fear, whether that's in a marriage, in a family, you start to handicap the vitality or the growth capacity of that organism. And so, if you're dissenting from an honest and earnest place to create a stronger reality, it's a virtue. Even if you're wrong, okay, it doesn't mean you have to have everything right, because even that dissenting view allows others to consider what they think is right, to refine their thinking, to think about the aspects that they hadn't accounted for well enough, to be in a prayerful seeking, which I think is so much a part of our faith, is this pursuit of knowledge, which is how it began. So, yeah, I think that one of the aspects of my faith, as I took it in as in my earliest years, was this idea that the truth mattered and pursuing it was good, and that it was a process. So that for me, and maybe it was partly my family's style, but I really saw that as really fundamental to being a Latter-day Saint, and not about just landing at the right answer and getting in a sort of static, kind of rigid position, but to stay open and pursuing of true wisdom.
Well, Jennifer, this has been a fascinating conversation. We really appreciate you coming on. I've learned a lot from this conversation just in the exploration we've gone through. We're rounding up to about an hour right now. Is there anything you'd like to close with? Any thoughts that you've had that have come to you during this discussion that you think this would kind of sum up your feelings about the divine feminine?
Well, I don't know. This is not kind of an undeveloped thought. It's just sort of coming into my mind. But we're in a period of transition, I think, in the church that's a little bit scary. To go back to how change can feel frightening. There's, I think a shift in how we access information. With COVID, there's been a lot of challenge, I think, to what have been ideas that sort of held for a long time, and I think that it's something that out of fear could push us either into rigidity or departure. And I'm just hoping that we can stay in that tension to keep evolving as a faith community, that we can embrace the uncertainty, that we can allow it to inform us, to allow us to keep growing and evolving and becoming more divine, to becoming more Zion-like, becoming wiser as individuals and collectively. Because, there's so much good here and so much room for us to grow. And so I do hope that we can stay invested in our individual ways in continuing to develop and contributing to the development through our honest engagement as a community.
Amen and amen.
I love that. And it really points to some of the work you're doing, especially. I mean, being engaged in this work is another form and expression of leadership that this church desperately needs and has always been there. and is now starting to really come to the fore. We really appreciate the work you're doing. I know there's many couples out there that appreciate what you're doing for them in trying to counter some of the narratives that have been dominant over the last however many decades. We appreciate the work that the leaders at the top and that they're contributing to the church and to the world. And I too am in for the ride on the tension between the balance of, grassroots and hierarchical leadership. And I think that we all have space to change in that work together. So again, I appreciate the conversation. Chris, anything you want to close with?
Just amen and amen. I agree with you, Riley. And thank you, Jennifer, for being with us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
So, folks, if you want to learn more about Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife, you can again go to www.finlayson-fife.com. And her new course coming out called Room for Two, the podcast, Room for Two is out. So check out her podcast, and we're again thankful for you to come and join us, and look forward to speaking with you again.
Yeah, we hope to have you back.
Thank you. I'd be happy to.
For Latter-day Contemplation, I'm Riley Risto.
And I'm Christopher Hurtado.
Have a great week, everyone.